This discussion is about the central nervous system. It consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And this is showing a 26-week-old fetal brain. The parts of the central nervous system of the brain consist of the cerebellum, the brain stem, the diencephalon, and the cerebral hemispheres. Here we see our cerebral hemispheres, our diencephalon, our brain stem, and then our cerebellum right here. We also consider the spinal cord, which has a central cavity surrounded by a gray matter core, and then the external white matter is composed of myelinated tracts. The brain has similar areas of gray matter, except the gray matter are in the cortex of the cerebellum and the cerebrum. We also have nuclei of gray matter in the cerebellum and cerebrum. This is showing the difference in the spinal cord. You see a little butterfly-shaped area that is your gray matter. And here we are in the brainstem. You have gray matter nuclei as well as a central area and a large central canal, where you only have a small central canal here. And then we're in the cerebellum. We have both gray matter in the cortex and matter here in the middle part, as well as nuclei. The ventricles of the brain are connected to each other and to the central canal of the spinal cord, and they're lined with ependymal cells. And they contain cerebral spinal fluid. We have two C-shaped lateral ventricles, a third ventricle in the diencephalon, and a fourth ventricle in the hindbrain. Here's a nice picture. You can really see how the lateral ventricles go tremendously out. This is your third ventricle, and this is your fourth ventricle right in here. It goes into the central canal of the spinal cord. Now we have surface markings of the brain. We call little small ridges gyri. One gyrus, two gyri. We call the shallow grooves sulci. One sulcus, two sulci. And then the very deep grooves are called fissures. So a small one is just a sulcus, whereas a fissure is a large groove. And we have the brain is divided into lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, as well as insula. Okay, the central sulcus, which we'll look at a picture in a minute, separates the frontal lobe, the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, and the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. Longitudinal fissure separates the two hemispheres. Transverse fissure separates the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Here is our central sulcus, frontal lobe here, and then to see the insula, you have to actually pull the temporal lobe down and the frontal lobe up, so it's hiding inside. And this is showing more. This is your central sulcus here, precentral gyrus, frontal lobe here, postcentral gyrus, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. These should be bringing back memories from your bone studies. This is an actual picture of the brain anterior, posterior parts, and this is a longitudinal fissure. And in the human brain, you see, is very different from the sheep brains we dissected because of the large cerebrum. But you have the transverse cerebral fissure here. Cerebral cortex has a very thin superficial layer of gray matter, 4 millimeters or so, makes up 40% of the mass of the brain. This is where your conscious mind resides. Your awareness, sensory perception, voluntary motor initiation, communication, memory storage, understanding, everything that makes you be you is located in the cerebral cortex. And each hemisphere connects to the contralateral side of the body. That means the other side. And there is some lateralization of cortical functions. The left has a few things the right doesn't have, vice versa. Functionally, we can divide this into motor areas that control voluntary movement, sensory areas that are consciously aware of the sensation, and then association areas that integrate all this sensation that comes in and makes a decision what to do with it. But conscious behavior involves the entire cerebral cortex. You can't just divide out and say, oh, this one little part is involved. Motor areas, I think the easiest thing is to look at the picture. Okay, here is our central sulcus here. Then we have the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, central eye field, Broca's area here, and then the prefrontal cortex. Okay, in the primary motor cortex has the large pyramidal cells of the precentral gyri right here. And very long axons. These are our corticospinal tracts from the cortex down to the spine. They're also called pyramidal tracts. And these allow conscious movement, control of movement. Now, the motor homunculi that we'll look at here in just a minute is showing an approximation of where and how much brain is involved in movement of certain places. As you see, the head, mouth, tongue, objects of swallowing, and the hands take up a tremendous amount of brain. Whereas your trunk, shoulder, hip, you don't get the fine tuning control on your hip, knee, your toes. So it takes much less of the brain to move your toes than it does to swallow. Now, the premotor cortex is just one bump up into the precentral gyrus, controls learned, repetitious, or patterned motor skills, helps coordinate simultaneous and sequential actions, and is involved in planning movements that depend on sensory feedback, which is basically all movements. Broca's area right here. This is involved in motor speech. It activates as you think about speaking, as you're putting words together. If someone has had a stroke in that area, they know exactly what they want to say, but they have a tremendous difficulty getting the words out. And unfortunately, they often can't write them down either because it's the same part of the brain that processes that part of the language. Okay, the frontal eye field was just anterior to the premotor cortex, and it controls eye movements. Now, sensory areas, we'll just look through the brain again. Here we have our central sulcus. It's unfortunate that the true brain is not color-coded. And we have our primary somatosensory cortex here, somatosensory association cortex here. There's our Wernicke's area. Primary visual cortex, and this is your visual association area. And okay, the primary, the first thing back, receives sensory input from things like skin, skeletal muscle, joints, and also you know what part of your body is being stimulated, so that you know that it's your left big toe that got stepped on and not your right big toe. And this is a homunculus for the sensation. Surprises a lot of people to see how the makeup of this is. A little bit on your guts, a lot again on swallowing and hands, foot, less on the genitalia, which might not be what one had in their thoughts. Okay, the somatosensory association cortex is going to be caudal to the last box, so right in here. And it integrates and makes sense of the sensations, determines size, texture, and relationships of parts that you feel. Now, the visual areas, We have the primary visual cortex way back here in the occipital lobe, and it receives sensation from the retinas. Now, the visual association area takes up a good bit of the occipital brain of the lobe, and it interprets visual stimuli. And it's very complex and involves basically the entire back half of the cerebral hemispheres. Another fact is that the visual association areas have to be developed early on in life. After 6 years of age, they're not developable. So therefore, if a child could have this issue of blindness that was treated and cured, but they were 10 when it happened, they might be able to look at a picture of a bicycle, draw it, but completely incapable of saying, oh, it's a bicycle, because it makes no sense to them. Auditory areas are somewhat more difficult to see, superior margin of the temporal lobes, and they interpret sounds such as pitch, loudness, location of the sounds. And then the auditory association areas are slightly posterior to the primary auditory cortex, and they permit perception of sounds, as help me remember sounds. Now, the olfactory cortex is difficult to see on a picture that we have, but it is where you smell. It's also related to the limbic system, which is emotion, and we get conscious awareness of odors from these areas. Gustatory cortex and the insula, involved in perception of taste. Visual sensory area, visceral sensory area, posterior to the gustatory cortex, and allows us to consciously perceive gut sensations, like your stomach hurts, your bladder's full, that type of thing. Now, the vestibular cortex is part of the insula, so up inside the brain, and lets us know where our head is in space. This is just a repeat of the picture we've gone through. Don't think I mentioned the Wernicke's area. So both of these, Wernicke and Broca's area, are involved in speech. A person who has a stroke in the Wernicke's area, or say a TIA, they're just suddenly out of, they lack of circulation to that area. They can speak beautifully. It's just the words they say makes no sense. This word salad, nothingness, sound as bad as an anatomy teacher. Okay, here is a cross section of the brain, and there's just a little bit to add on this. We see another gyrus you can't see from the outside, which is your cingulate gyrus. And then you've already seen the corpus callosum, the fornix, and the thalamus. This is your primary olfactory cortex, which was impossible to see from the other pictures. Multimodal association areas. This is basically all through the brain. You have areas that receive input from sensations and give it meaning, help you store memories of them, decide based on previous action what to do, such as if you took this course before and you didn't study and you failed it, you're taking it again, you may decide to study this time because of the multimodal association areas. Okay, we have three parts: the anterior association area, posterior association area, and limbic association area. The anterior association area, or your prefrontal cortex, is very complicated, very complex. It's involved in intellect, cognition, recall, personality, and it has a working memory for judgment, reasoning, perception, conscience, and it depends on feedback from social environment. It's extremely important that young children have intellectual as well as physical touch when they're growing, very little babies, children, toddlers, that they are talked to, that they learn, that they see things, that they touch things, see different colors. Otherwise, they're not going to develop these association areas, and their intellect will suffer. posterior association areas and the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes involved in recognizing patterns and faces, and then understanding written and spoken language, which is the Wernicke's area. Limbic association area is your emotional impact. It's also helps to establish memories. Now we'll look at specific areas, but we'll look at the limbic system functionality. Okay, now the left cerebral hemisphere is thought to be more involved in math, logic, language, right, more on insight, spatial skills, intuition, and artistic skills, and they communicate through fibrous tracts in the cerebral white matter. However, it's thought that it may not be quite this simple, and if you think about it, you can't paint a picture if you don't logically know what colors to pick out, what paintbrush to use. So you use all of the brain for everything. Cerebral white matter is myelinated fibers and their tracts. I'm sure you recall their tracts in the central nervous system. They are considered nerves once they leave the central nervous system. So these tracts are responsible for communication, and probably the easiest thing is to look at the picture here. Okay, this is the commissural fibers, which is in the corpus callosum, left brain, right brain communication. Association fibers, all through here, different parts of the brain are associating with each other. And then we have your projection fibers. And you can notice that they are decussating or crossing over in the medulla oblongata, so that this part of the brain sends signals for motion, sensation, whatever, to that side of the body. Okay, basal nuclei are basal ganglia. These are beneath the cortex, so they're called subcortical nuclei. And they're little areas of gray matter. And we have the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, and they're functionally associated with subthalamic nuclei, as well as the substantia nigra in the midbrain. And this is showing a whole bunch of them. Caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, putamen, globus, pallidus, thalamus is very important, corpus striatum. And this is showing from a different angle the same things, and in an actual brain. Okay, now anytime an anatomy book says that the function of something is somewhat elusive, I define that as to be they're not too sure what it does. But basal nuclei are thought to be influence muscle control, regulate attention and cognition, regulate slow or stereotype movements, and inhibit antagonistic or unnecessary movements. The diencephalon, which consists of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, enclose the third ventricle. So here we have our thalamus, this big round structure. It was very easy to see in your dissection. Hypothalamus is immediately under it. You can see the pituitary gland hanging off the infundibulum here, and your pineal gland here. Okay, the thalamus is the gateway to the cerebral cortex. It sorts, edits, relays information. Everything from the body has to go through the thalamus to get to the brain. Everything in the brain has to go through the thalamus. It filters, gets rid of things you're not interested in, and it helps regulate impulses from everything. It mediates arousal, learning, memory, impulses from the cerebellum. It's just a sorting, editing, relay station. Hypothalamus has many nuclei, and it has an infundibulum, which is a stalk that connects to the pituitary gland. And we'll talk about the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus relationship much more in the endocrine system. Now, hypothalamus is involved with functions, autonomic control center. visceral functions like helping control blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, digestive tract motility, also emotion, pleasure, rage, fear, happiness, many other things like temperature, food intake, water balance, thirst, sleep cycle, and it also controls the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary and produces the hormones of the posterior pituitary. The epithalamus is the home of the pineal gland. The pineal gland receives signals from the retina that let it know whether there is light coming in or not. If you have light, the pineal gland does not release melatonin. If you're sitting around in the dark, it releases melatonin, and that makes you sleepy, so it helps you regulate sleep-wake cycles. We've seen this picture. Okay, the brain stem has the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Brain stem, very similar in structure to the spinal cord, important for automatic behaviors, and has fiber tracts connecting higher and lower centers, and 10 to 12 pairs of cranial nerves come off of the brain stem. And here we have our medulla oblongata here. Midbrain nuclei are, again, little pieces of gray matter that are located outside the cortexes of the brain. Superior colliculus, y'all remember we looked at that. The easiest place to find that was when we moved the cerebellum down and looked between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. You could easily see the superior and inferior colliculi. They're known as a corpora quadrigemini. Okay, the superior is involved in visual reflex centers, inferior with auditory relay centers. Now, the substantia nigra is linked with basal nuclei, and we've talked repeatedly about when you have malfunction of the dopamine-producing cells in the substantia nigra, that is what causes Parkinson's disease. So basal nuclei, since they control fine-tuned movements, that makes sense. The red nucleus is for relaying some of the descending motor pathways. It's also part of the reticular formation, which we'll talk about later. The pons, anterior wall, the fourth ventricle, it's a connection between high brain centers and the spinal cord. Relays impulses from the motor cortex and the cerebellum, also the origin of cranial nerves, 5 trigeminal, 6 abducens, 7 facial, and has some of the nuclei of the reticular formation, helps maintain a normal breathing rhythm. Now, the medulla oblongata joins the spinal cord at the foramen magnum, and this is where you get decussation of the pyramids, which means the crossover of the corticospinal tract. So the crossing over of the messages from the left side of the brain to the right side of the body. Also, medulla is important for autonomic reflex center, cardiovascular centers. It does adjust and fine-tune heart rate, blood pressure. The heart can run without signals from the medulla oblongata if you have respiration taking place. Respiratory centers, the medulla is where you have the respiratory rhythm generated. So without the medulla, you don't breathe. Also, the medulla oblongata helps regulate vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing. Now, we mentioned the hypothalamus is involved in a lot of things, such as the vomiting centers, but this fine-tunes your barf so that it will be very perfect. Okay, the cerebellum is about 11% of the brain mass, dorsal to the pons and the medulla, and what it does is it provides precise timing of a skeletal muscle contraction. It helps to regulate this. It has 2 hemispheres connected by the vermis, and the arbor vitae is the white matter within the cerebellum. Let's look at this picture. Anterior lobe of the cerebellum, posterior lobe, flocculonodular lobe up here, and here is cerebellar cortex, and the white matter is referred to as the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. Now, the cerebellum is important for processing of voluntary motor activity, fine-tunes, and gives you basically gives your cerebral cortex a fine-tuning plan, a finely tuned plan for organizing muscle contraction. Maybe some cognitive function involved in the cerebellum, word association and puzzle solving, and also recognizing patterns and sequence of events. And that's all for part A, and we'll do part B here shortly. Thank you.